I will share the screen. So, as most of you know, I work at the Swiss Tropical and Public Health Institute in Basel. I'm a clinician, I'm a clinical researcher, I'm increasingly a manager. In my role, I head the Department of Medicine, which is a newly created department. Well, it's not that new anymore now, it's about 5 years old, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a minute. But I am really trying to promote a more translational medicine aspect at the Swiss Tropical and Public Health Institute, which is a very interesting endeavor, especially in view of international partnerships and interdisciplinary consortia. And I just want to present to you today a little bit of a story on this. So I'll start off with my personal research and then go and introduce the Swiss TPH a little more. For those of you who don't know exactly what's going on at this institute, which is spread around the globe, and then delve a little bit more in depth into the international partnership aspects, looking at academic industry interactions and product development partnerships or public-private partnerships, and how this could affect improvements, you know, in our global health network and health equity globally. So we'll start here. This is an image where I worked at the time. Myanmar border is actually a refugee camp in Burma at the time. And you can see here, this is a malaria clinic. It's a fever clinic. So people with febrile illnesses present to this clinic. And before you can even get into the clinic, you get a finger prick and you get a malaria screen test. And fever is and remains a major complaint worldwide. It's one of the most common presentations to medical attention, not only in tropical countries, but even in more developed countries. And we still have to exclude malaria as a primary cause. It's a very, very important aspect. Now, in the other image, you can see a gentleman with his hand in his pocket, and he was very famous and known for his diagnostic capabilities. And for those of you who do not recognize him, this is Sir William Osler. Picture was taken 1903, and he could diagnose a typhoid case just by looking at the patient. And obviously, you know, you can estimate the diagnostic accuracy behind that approach, but it is quite astonishing that even though we are now 100 years, 120 years later, that our diagnostic capabilities still remain highly limited and are actually not really much further, because access to diagnostics has remained very poor, and the understanding of the clinical epidemiology in these settings are extremely limited. So the cause of these illnesses remain unknown. And this is just to show you a little bit, one of the very first fever studies we made in Laos, where we looked at patients with fever who were malaria negative and were blood culture negative. And we found scrub typhus and murine typhus and spotted fever typhus cases, which we had never really heard about and thought about at the time. We actually found that 28% of these malaria negative and blood culture negative fevers were attributable to an easily treatable disease called typhus, caused by rickettsial bacteria. And if you look at the doxycycline, which is the cheapest antibiotic available there, the doxycycline responsiveness, leptospirosis goes into that entity, and you have actually 38% of these causes would be treatable with this inexpensive antibiotic. So we asked ourselves, is it generalizable to Laos, to Southeast Asia, beyond? What about Africa and Asia? And this sort of triggered a long story into unraveling clinical epidemiology. It's a very interesting time, but actually defining what the common causes of fever are, or any syndrome, helps you to inform control programs, to establish treatment guidelines, to develop algorithms on diagnosis and treatment, to know which tests are clinically relevant in this setting, or which vaccines we need to prioritize in the development, or where we need to invest, for example, and we need to have platforms in place to detect emerging infectious diseases, etc. So clinical epidemiology is really about knowing what's out there, because it really defines a lot of our medical interventions. And so the story actually started off like that. This really was my very first study in Laos at the time. And I moved from clinical research, looking at patients, trying to see what the common patterns were for hospitalization. This led me into the difficulties of diagnostics, because obviously you only find what you look for, and you need to establish diagnostics, which means development, validation processes. Then the new diseases you discover, you put on the map, and you actually have a mapping of your epidemiology. You go into risk factors, you have to go into the ecological spheres, you have to look at rodent-borne diseases or vector-borne diseases. In my case, I had to look at mites, as you can see here on the top right-hand corner. This is a leptotrombidium mite here. This is a little glass capillary, and we actually had to really examine these vectors in more detail, because they transmitted diseases we didn't know about previously. We found pathogens in fish. This picture here is actually Anabas testinudeus. It's the only fish that can climb a tree, and it harbors these bacteria as well. And if you eat a raw fish, you get the disease. And then that brought in looking at the pathophysiology, at the immunology of these diseases, and then ultimately led to developing a non-human primate model and moving into vaccine development. So this broad spectrum, or this sort of path through this clinical research entity, actually brought me to Swiss TPH, and was the basis really for developing more translational research at the Institute. You can see here, this is a beautiful new building in Allschwil. We just completed the first year in it, and I have to say it's truly a wonderful feeling to have an entire institute under one single roof. So if ever you can make it over to Allschwil, please do let me know, and we're most happy to accommodate you. The statements, the mission statements of the Institute is to improve health and the well-being of people locally, nationally, and internationally, and to make the world a healthier place. That's why the title of the talk today was chosen as such. We have about 920 employees at present, about 200, a bit more than 200 actually work and live abroad the whole time. About 700 are based in Basel, but travel regularly to different study sites. We have over 260 active projects all over the world. It's a multinational population at Swiss TPH. We've got more than 80 different nationalities, and and we work in more than 133 countries. So it's a very diverse, very broad collection of interesting colleagues working together for the same cause. We're actually structured into 5 departments. There's a basic science department called Medical Parasitology and Infection Biology, the MPI, where we're looking especially into diseases of poverty, host pathogen interactions, and looking at developing diagnostics, drugs, and vaccines. We've got a more epidemiological and public health department. It's a very large one actually, who's looking at health and diseases in the social, ecological, and genetic determinants approaches. We've got the Department of Medicine, which I head myself, which is looking much more into clinical and diagnostic services and bridging services into clinical research with a focus on low and middle income settings. We've got the Swiss Center for International Health, which in itself is a little institute, if you so want, because they really advise on healthcare systems globally. So the many various ways of developing a healthcare system is dissected and looked at the SCIH, and this is more of a service provision in the sense of policy support. And the 5th and the smallest department, but not at all the least important, is education and training. So we've got a dedicated department for this. This is where all our PhD students and masters and courses and international training efforts are grouped together. So this basically forms the Swiss TPH. And if we now go a little bit more into the Department of Medicine here, you can see in this organogram that we have 5 units. The core element at Swiss TPH is the unit. So it's always a unit head with a series of groups underneath. And we have units for services as pictured in green here, and we have units for research as pictured in this brown color. And then we have units which do both, sort of do services for research or research for services, etc. So we are the only hybrid department combining services and research. And we've got the Swiss National Reference Diagnostic Laboratory for Tropical Medicine in this department. We've got our own CRO called Clinical Operations. We've got a dedicated clinical research unit looking at TB and HIV and fever management, which is now transitioning into a more specific malaria and helminth clinical research structure, because we are working towards optimizing and developing clinical trial efforts for new drugs coming into the pipelines. And then after licensure, FDA, EMA, Swissmedic, we actually continue our research on these drugs, diagnostics and vaccines in our implementation research unit. And we have a medicines development unit where we develop mainly diagnostics and vaccines. And because we've got such a broad area of competence, we actually have our admin, our quality management, our statistics and data management, and our human subject research study desk taken out of this structure, because we can then put together advisory boards tailored to the needs of each of these different units. And this is the Department of Medicine in a nutshell. So we combine services and research. We're increasingly working with industry on product development partnerships. We now are capable of offering a whole package for clinical trials. So if you have a drug candidate, we can take it from first in man all the way to licensure and beyond into the implementation phase. And we provide project management monitoring and all the services you need. We actually now are also sponsor for 3 trials. And this has taken up quite a lot of development work the past couple of years. The Institute supports the value chain from innovation and validation to application for drugs, diagnostics and vaccines, with a focus on these low and middle income countries. And just want to show you a few examples here, some which are quite sort of self-explanatory. And this is, for example, when we introduced the RDTs in some of our hospitals in the network. You can see here that malaria test positivity was much higher in the era where microscopy was the main diagnostic tool, and then dropped substantially when the really accurate and reliable RDTs were initiated. And this is just to show how big an impact you can make by introducing good quality tools. These little beasts here cause sleeping sickness, and we were heavily involved in the entire development process of fexinidazole. This is the world's first oral treatment regimen against sleeping sickness. You have to know that the previous drugs for sleeping sickness actually had a mortality of almost 8% in themselves. So it was very high risk to get treated by these arsine holding drugs, and this is a much safer drug, and you can see the complexity here. And it was developed with a total of 4 pharmaceutical companies and 8 academic institutions, mainly with DNDi, to take it from preclinical to the actual licensure process. Another interesting story is mapping tuberculosis across the globe. You can see that there are 6 lineages which are defining TB across the world. And we've been able to show that there is a very strong association with different populations. and this clearly affects your choice in drugs and vaccines and preventive measures. And we've actually built a clinical research group around this, and we're looking not only from the clinical epidemiology aspects, but rather now into diagnostics, drugs, vaccines, and also redirecting or repurposing drugs to improve TB treatment. And this is a very interesting area. I'm just taking this as an example. There's many examples, of course, to talk about, but we're improving diagnostics, we're improving drug regimens, so multiple drugs together, doing clinical trials, looking into evaluating new vaccines. These are attenuated M. bovis candidates, and obviously continuing to dissect the epidemiology. So this is just an example to show you the spectrum of activities, working in communities, looking at mitigation strategies, looking at artificial intelligence for analyzing medical imaging. We have our own cohort in Tanzania where we can do nested trials and studies in longitudinal analyses, looking at the next generation urine tests, looking at host-directed treatment for drug-resistant TB, so how we can fortify existing TB regimens by looking at the host, and obviously going right to the field, to the patient at the point of care level to improve diagnosis and management. And in order to do all this, we needed to develop the clinical operations unit. So this is a clinical trial support unit, if you so want, or a CRO for the more regulatory trials. And you can see that there is a lot of active projects going on in Africa at present, but also in Europe. And we now have our first dots coming up in Southeast Asia and also in Peru in the near future. We're specializing in risk-based solutions, so it depends on the setting, it depends on the awareness and understanding of the local population on how stringent we actually perform monitoring or project management, etc. There's a lot of experience in this group, and we've now expanded in providing regulatory support, quality assurance, on top of the usual project management and logistics and monitoring and site management, etc. There's a lot of training going on. We're now building a network of clinical operations. So we have our own teams in the Congo, in the DRC, in Tanzania, in building now in Côte d'Ivoire as well. And this partnership network is now the basis for really involving our partners mutually at an international level. And this sort of brings me back again to the clinical epidemiology from the very first part of the talk. And you can see here that after doing a multitude of these fever studies in different areas, we actually see different disease profiles in different regions of the world. And this is the basis of the necessity to have partnerships globally. This is the necessity or the basis of working in global health. You can't apply the same interventions in Southeast Asia as you would in South America, for example. And there's different diseases which are more common. Doctors have a different understanding, and healthcare policies are adapted to regional problems. And you can see here on the left, these are the most common sort of reported infectious diseases to date, and our diagnostic development endeavors sort of focused on these areas. The big three, obviously, viruses, bacteria, and the parasites. And sort of to emphasize the power and the diversity of these networks, you know, it's really important to realize that there are more competencies, there's more stability, and obviously much more sustainability by having partnerships, by having really a mutually developed partner in place in an area of endemic diseases. And this allows you to actually have larger studies. You can have the partners work together in South-South collaborations, and you can perform bigger cohort studies and trials. You can develop surveillance platforms, as we're now doing with the next generation sequencing approach in Africa. You can have multinational, multi-center studies, And you can help each other out in difficult times, like in a pandemic. So there is actually a very strong stability component into developing partnerships. But there's also another aspect of partnerships, and that is the product development partnerships. And this is bringing the story a bit more back to Europe now, where in order to improve our diagnostics or vaccines, in order to develop these things, we have now started to work much more closely with industry. We've got these consortia consisting of foundations of academic and industry partners to develop new protein array-based diagnostics, urine-based electrochemical sensing, and saliva-based, simple, inexpensive, rapid diagnostic tests, which have all really interesting stories in themselves, and we don't have the time to go into this, but I just want to sort of bring this up, that it's very important to increase the academic and industry collaborations. And I would really like to maybe afterwards discuss and hear your opinion on how we could make these things smoother, these interactions. You know, there's like university technology licensing programs, which are setting up patent pools where universities can actually share certain assets from intellectual property portfolios, which will make the whole licensing process of technologies much easier. It's about establishing public-private partnerships, you know, like TB Alliance, where Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and FIND and Unitaid sort of all came together to improve TB diagnostics. Or a recent example is the University of Oxford, which teamed up with AstraZeneca on the COVID vaccine, etc. And these processes are iterative. We need to really think how these two worlds can be brought together a bit more closely, and a sort of, you know, widely discussed approach is working into the next generation, like introducing students to industry-related work much earlier, because students often come from a university background, and universities sort of bring the academic flavor, and then the transition to industry is more difficult. And there are many approaches about this, and I think this would really merit a session on its own in the future at some point. But we are now actually working very closely together on multiple projects and having iterative development of drugs, for example, or diagnostics. And vaccines are slowly coming up now. We're not really yet fully established in the vaccine development area. We've only got 2 candidates in the pipeline. But we really want to strengthen this bridge, and I'd be interested in your thoughts about this. So in order to sort of summarize everything, there's a lot of power and a lot of value in developing partnerships. And this sort of all works towards improving health equity locally, nationally, but also internationally. So if we nurture, oops, I think now something just froze here. So if we nurture long-term collaborations, we build trust. If we respect principles, you know, as they're defined in the Commission for Research Partnerships, we actually have key performance indicators to see how our partnerships evolve. If we benefit from each other's strength, it's mutual, give and take, you know, it's the basis for equity. If we co-develop our strategies from the beginning, we set the agenda and grow together. If we co-evolve together, then roles and responsibilities are shared and future planning is secured. And this is the basis really for a unique global health network of partnerships. For those of you who are interested in these KFPE or this Commission for Research Partnership Principles, this is the link here. And you know, we have to remember that taking initiative is not taking control. We need genuine partnerships, and partnerships are much more than a collaboration. And this is an improved way of working together, and it's a first major step of building health equity worldwide. And with that, I'll close here, hopefully on time, Christina, and hand over back to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Daniel. Does anyone have any questions from the audience? Maybe you can also show your face when you ask these questions.
Hi, Daniel. I'm not sure, I have a little bit of problem with the video, but I just wanted to tell you that I truly enjoyed your presentation about demonstrating what capabilities TPH has. I'm by myself a researcher, a clinical researcher as well by background, and I'm currently working at Roche in diabetes care. Nevertheless, I remember my times working in Singapore, and it's just happened to be like the, tropical diseases area. And I also remember my friend working in, came for 1 year fellowship, working at Novartis, working with specific, also in partnerships with TPH and such infectious diseases. So I fully agree with you. You can go way farther the moment you are actually partnering with others instead of working in the silos. And the importance of partnerships with academia, with clinical sites, with clinicians, with scientists and industry is crucial to make advancements in the research and progress to so-called making this world better, to really advance, especially in the neglected diseases, in the communities where people are really needed. And this, so my friend, for example, works in leishemias, I think, I'm not sure if I pronounce it as well, in Colombia, and she seeks for partnerships. So maybe I can connect both of you to maybe do a little grain into that, because it just occurred to me that it would be great to connect both of you in that space. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you very much, Anisha, and your comments are much appreciated. I just saw in the chat somebody asking where in Southeast Asia we want to establish more work. This will be in Vientiane in Laos, in the Lao PDR, where we're working with the National Institute of Health in the Lao PDR, now setting up clinical research. So we had a first phase of epidemiological and public health research, and now building cohort studies and doing nested clinical studies within there.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, this is Ting. Thank you for answering that question. And I'm also curious about this selection of curious tropical diseases. Is it limited to infectious communicable diseases, or are you, because one thing I'm asking is because we were dealing with a oncology, liver cancer epidemic in one of the Southeast Asian countries. And one of the issue we're having is actually the Hep B vaccination difficulty for the out of hospital births. And it doesn't seem to be addressed anywhere in this region, even though it could be a major issue. But I'm just curious. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the comment. And I mean, obviously in 25 minutes, it's impossible to present all the projects we're doing. I mean, there's a huge number of projects. I mean, there's 260 active projects, and Hep B definitely is on the list. Hep B is really important, especially from mother to child transmission, especially in Asia. There's many aspects to that. But I actually put in the diseases on this world map image to show more the endemic disease profiles. So if you go to hospitals, anywhere in the world, in low and middle income setting, and you ask the local doctors, what is the most common cause of fever? You will get so many different answers, and then you can ask, well, what is the evidence upon which you actually decide which disease is more important than another, or more common if you so want? And then you will find that there's a huge heterogeneity in the quality of evidence, and mostly it's not available. And I think for Asia now, this has been really worked upon together with the University of Oxford, where I spent 12 years of my life living in Southeast Asia, as Alex Matra knows, based in Bangkok with with the Oxford Clinical Research Group. And an important finding, for example, is that the incidence of malaria is now 2%, you know, in most countries of Southeast Asia. Whereas in Africa, this is over 25 to 30%, causing febrile illness. So it's really important to know these profiles. But just to make the circle, there are many different diseases we're working on. Non-communicable diseases are extremely on the rise. All the cardiovascular problems arising from arterial hypertension and from diabetes are really, really high on the list now. And we're starting at the epidemiological level and now working towards the more clinical interventional level.
Thank you.
Yes.
Leah, you raised your hand very early on.
Yes, hi. Apologize for the video malfunction. I couldn't fix it. Daniel, thank you so much it's very insightful, great, encouraging, really, thanks. I have two questions. One is more curiosity driven, if you will, with my hat on of the head of search and evaluation point, and the other is about the partnerships. So in terms of how do you find these places that you go to work for? So is it like the disease driven, and then you just reach out to the places that are more ridden by those, or do you have some sort of a more sophisticated search and evaluation tool, both for the diseases and finding the places that are most suitable for your research? So that's my first question. And the second one about the partnerships. Yes, we all agree that we need more of those and more smoother, more efficient. I mean, so far, I don't know, for the last 10 years, I've been spending time on this. It's very hard to find any one particular model that is all, perfect and working well or perfectly. I have a question for you. So from your perspective, while working with pharma, what would be one of your kind of top difficulties that you've encountered from your own personal perspective? Was it in the science? Was it in legal? Was it in interactions? What is follow-up? So this is something that is an ongoing thing we're doing both at Novartis, at the universities. So we'd be very interested to just kind of quick high-level thing to hear. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you, Thea. Those are two absolutely fundamental questions, which we could talk about for hours, actually. No. So for the first question about how to select a study site. So there's actually two tracks for this. There's the more epidemiological public health track, where we are approached. We are approached regularly from colleagues. These are mainly clinicians, a lot of clinical epidemiologists from all over the world presenting problems, and then projects are developed. And it's interesting that very often you have to define the clinical epidemiology as a foundation. So these are usually the entry studies. And then on that, you develop the diagnostics based on the most common diseases. Once you have diagnostics, you have all the inclusion criteria or the endpoint criteria for clinical trials, and then you build. So it's sort of an evolution. And the second track is actually history. So we have partnerships which date back to the 1940s, believe it or not, World War II era, when the Tropical Institute was founded. And these go back to Tanzania and the Ivory Coast. And then the next ones, probably around 40 years ago, are in Laos and in the DRC. So there's also a lot of history associated with this.
So Daniel, sorry to interrupt. So this, would you say that most of this work then is the initiation point is reactive rather than proactive? Or do you also just go out there actively searching for both diseases, pathogens, emerging projects?
Yes, so it was reactive historically, and now with the creating of the Department of Medicine, we are much more proactive. We do site evaluations. We actually go and actively look for the best site for certain trials where we know there's the you know, you get the right number of cases, you get the right questions answered, you can actually generate the data you need to, or the evidence to achieve whatever you want, if it's a trial or if you want to inform policy or whatever. So it's both. And it's increasingly shifting from a more passive to a more active site finding approach.
Got it. Thank you.
The second question sort of relates to this, the partnerships. Can you just quickly say what exactly did you want to know about the partnerships?
No, I was just from your personal experience of interacting with pharma specifically. Would you, there are a couple of just very high level top, you know, difficulties that you can just touch upon. I know. It's, you know.
So I think the absolute topmost was getting academics to fulfill all the regulatory requirements. Now we just moved into this era now with the you know, the GCP R2 regulations coming in 2016, 2018, moving into that. So there was a lot of unrest and adjustments which needed to be made, writing SOPs, establishing procedures, and getting this GXP compliance. So this was one of the major difficulties we had. The second one really was getting the industry into the field. But I think now with these partnerships, this has improved dramatically. And the third one would be sort of co-funding strategies. And these taking all three together, I think, is a really wonderful way to move forward in these international partnerships.
Thank you, Daniel. Very, very informative and agreed fully.
Maybe I'll go next. My question was somewhat related to the last comment actually around funding, but nice to see you again, Daniel, and others. This is my first one I've joined live. We met at the Asheville Tennis Club, if you recall, when you were training.
Oh gosh, yes, I do remember. Yes, I was thinking, yes.
Yeah, so Asheville's the place to be.
Yes, I haven't been there in a while.
Around, the funding of your institution versus, and maybe how this has changed, and maybe you were touching on signs of perhaps going to more of a bit of a CRO service offering. Is that to help support funding, like for things to, you know, come back in and sustainably, you know, finance the research questions that you're more proactively working on now? Just be interested in like how that's set up.
Yeah,
I guess then maybe how then your partnerships are, like where funding expectations versus in kind, and just you can, it's a lot in that question, so obviously just a quick response.
Yeah, well, yeah, thanks, Lauren. It's a great question, because it's actually part of the business model, a bit of this, to mix and balance academic trials with the pharmaceutical or industry related trials. At present, we have, so when I started just over 5 years ago, the pipeline was completely empty. And we now have a ratio of 7:2, 7:3 academic to industry studies. So there's still a predominance of academic IITs, so investigator initiated trials, but we're now moving more and more into the industry associated regulatory trials. And actually by achieving the sponsor role now and having all this GXP compliance work behind us, we've actually got 18 assessments going on and audits because we moved into this field now. I think we're really aiming towards a sort of a 50-50 or 60-40 ratio of academic to industry related studies. And there's huge synergy there. And especially the students which we're developing, or which are growing with this. So here and in the low and middle income country settings, they actually grow up already with this joint synergistic approach. And I think this is really important to develop health equity on the long term. So it's all sort of a strategic thing, but it's also a business thing. And I think you picked up on that absolutely correctly. Yeah.
May I ask you, Daniel, how about the regulatory arm of WHO? wouldn't they be able to help you to support you in regulatory activities, and do they do that?
This is a very good question, Alex. At present, no, they do not. I mean, we have, I think we have 7 centers of competence with WHO. So there's a very strong academic bridge.
Yeah.
So far, the bridge to regulatory support is almost non-existent, I would say.
Okay.
So this is a very important comment. I'll make a note. Thank you. I'll follow up on it.
Yeah. How can you strengthen the incentives for industry to work in this field? Because obviously the profit motive is not predominant. And so what makes industry actually want to work with you?
Yes, well, this is something which I was hoping to tease out of you a bit. I'll try to show what we're doing and try to, you know. Well, I think, I mean, I could show you so many success stories, but there's also a lot of, you know, stories which then sort of ended because of funding, because of lack of continuation.
Yes.
But the success stories are really, really nice. And I think they should be a very strong motivator for this academic industry collaboration. I also think that the markets, you know, I mean, I think that the LMICs are underestimated in terms of market potential because they are growing, you know, they are really developing. I mean, there are countries where I think most of us would be really impressed by the level of data management they already have, by the level of IT. They are better than we are here in Europe in many aspects. And so I think the markets are underestimated. I think the fact that we have well-established partnerships and have a very open culture in addressing difficulties which you would encounter if you started a new partnership is a very strong argument to work with us. Yes, and I think those are sort of the bigger ones, and then there's many smaller ones in terms of capacity building, infrastructure setting up, you know, connections in the country, links to the ministries of health. So there's actually quite a lot of facilitators for pharmaceutical activities if there's a collaboration set up.
Daniel, I think I'm next. Thank you for this wonderful talk, and it was really very interesting to know how TPH works and how the units were divided, and also your view on disease prevalence around the world and the differences. I wish we could have even had more of a discussion around that. That was really very interesting. My question is somewhat related to Alex's. I was wondering how your worldview of what is important, what is changing in the global health view is related to what the WHO or other major health organizations. How do you work together? Do you have an independent view? Do you find yourself sometimes at a different viewpoint than what the current view is of some of the other major global organizations? Because we do need to go to resources, you know, to find out what the world view is about certain diseases. And I'm just trying to understand how you network, collaborate, and how you differ from each other in your view of world health.
Well, yes, that's a very good question. So, how much time have we got? I think
5 more minutes.
I'm looking at Christina here.
Yeah, no. 5 more minutes, sorry.
Yes. I mean, obviously, we keep track of all the health indicators, you know, coming out from WHO, from the World Bank, from the various sources. And I have to say, we really observe big similarities. I think there's quite a lot of convergence in this. I mean, obviously, there is always a dialogue because of the many joint projects going on. But it's interesting that migration is really a topic which is moving up the ladder. Planetary health and climate change are really going up high. The NCDs are slowly taking over the infectious diseases. So the silent pandemic of cardiovascular problems, you know, like, so we're moving into these areas as well. But still, you know, drugs and diagnostics and vaccines are sort of more directed against managing infectious diseases. So there's a gradual shift where different entities moving at different speeds. So it is a slow machinery, WHO, and this is also reflected at the Institute, even though we are much more agile and we can initiate smaller projects more quickly in different countries. So, but yes, you're absolutely right. More dialogue is needed. That it is probably not sufficient, the communication between WHO and institutes like us, not only us. Yeah. Thank you for that.
Sascha?
Yes, thank you, Christina. Hi, Daniel. I'm Sascha from Novartis, and I have worked quite extensively in some of these geographies, predominantly Southeast Asia and some places in Africa. One of the things when running clinical trials there, I found it quite difficult to do clinical trials in the communities. And so my question is more, how actually do you manage to reach to the communities? Because I found it is much easier to work with academic hospitals, universities, but for a lot of the clinical trials work is really needs to reach the patient from the community. So do you work with some local partners for your clinical trials? If you can give some information, that would be great.
Yes, so this is a very timely topic. The whole decentralization process, right? I mean, decentralizing trials is a major topic at clinical operations here. So we're really working more with the communities, with healthcare centers, away from hospitals, but always linked to hospitals. So there is a network going out.
Mm-hmm.
And in order to get the data back, and for, you know, as you know, the most difficult part is always getting high follow-up rates for trials. This needs a central or a hierarchical network. So you would have a referral center, and then you would have a regional hospital, then you would have a local healthcare center, and then you would have the healthcare communities, and it goes back like that. So we're very much organized and mobile, and often, you know, use teams with motorbikes or bicycles, working within healthcare regions or catchment areas. So the whole decentralized approach is more and more important. And yes, we work with local staff and we train local staff. So we actually do GCP training on a regular basis on site for the staff involved, and, you know, teach on the importance of data integrity and the need for audit trails and all those aspects which are so important in getting data which can then be used for an FDA submission or an EMA submission in the end.
Yeah. Thanks very much, Daniel.
Alex wanted to ask something again, and then I think that should be the last question.
Can I ask you, Daniel, how did recent geopolitical events affect your work? And are you in any way affected by the tensions that are rising worldwide?
Yes, well, there's actually, unfortunately, there's many examples here. I mean, we talked about the Ethiopia visit right at the beginning. So that's, I mean, I can just bring a couple of examples if you'd like. So one which directly affected my group was we're actually doing the first systematic causes of fever study within a refugee camp in Ethiopia. And this was set up in the Tigray district. And this was firstly postponed for almost 2 years because of the pandemic. And we had to establish COVID diagnostics before we could establish any other diagnostics, which was good and which really helped. But then the internal conflict arose, and it was really bad. I mean, there were mines placed around the refugee camp. We couldn't get in, and those who were in couldn't get out. We had personal attacks on staff, quite a few actually, and they had to be repatriated to Addis and then also repatriated to Switzerland. So this is at a very operational level now. And another example would be obviously the crisis with Russia and the Ukraine, where more on a health system policy level, we have been severely affected, and many projects have been slowed down considerably because we couldn't get into the actual field and speak with the high-level policymakers.
Okay, thank you.
So this is a risk, and I was mentioning risk-based assessments, and I mean, this is a risk. It's an inherent risk if you work in these fields, and especially if you work in the area of migration medicine. And we are aware of this. So you have to diversify your projects.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Daniel, and thank you very much for everyone who raised all these very interesting questions. I guess we could talk for another hour or two. If you now see that this is really a topic you would like to go and discuss deeper or diversify it a little bit, then please let me know. You have my email on the flyer, and I'm very happy to set up like a part 2 of this topic, if you like. Or we can form like a little chat group in case you have more questions. So thank you all very much, in particular to you, Daniel. And I wish you all a really nice afternoon.
Thank you.
And a nice weekend.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Christina.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.
All the best, Daniel.
Thank you, Alex. Bye-bye.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.